Aziz Anaman, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to this very special episode of A Soldier Speaks exclusive. And today I've got here with me my friend Tony Gosling, joining us from Bristol. Tony, welcome to the show.
Hi, everybody.
So, Tony, before we start, let me give a brief premise. A few weeks earlier, I was in Bristol, and the vibe in Bristol it was very independent because once we were sitting there, I was invited by Tony Gosling, and at his radio show, the kind of stuff they were saying, I asked them, well, this kind of stuff can get you in trouble in the UK, but Tony did not simply give, he simply didn't care about it. And he said certain things in response, which I'm not going to, talk about right now, because Tony's got the white advantage. I haven't got that. So yeah, Tony can say all those things to you, but the vibe. The next day, we were having this lunch. Me, my better half, Tony, his lady wife. We were having this lunch, and we had this big, huge congregation supporting Palestine going on and about. Right. Right. I haven't seen anything like that. Maybe in London, nowhere else. I've traveled everywhere in the UK. But the vibe of that city, I was told, is due to people like Tony Gosling, who are leaders of the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of press. And he has been working with the BBC. I would ask Tony to please introduce himself to all of you before we move on to very relevant topics. But I'll introduce you to the topics after Tony has introduced himself. And while Tony will be introducing himself, I'll be showing you a couple of books written by Tony. And I would request you to go to bibelo.co.uk if you're interested in buying those books. Over to you, Tony, please.
Yeah, or they're available on eBay too. But look, okay. As for me, I was brought up in a family business in aviation, and really enjoyed it as a teenager, and my early 20s, working on airfields, mostly in civil aviation, and with business jets and flying clubs. So that's how I got my sort of start after studying English, and I was brought up in southeast London. Biggin Hill was where we were based at the airport there, which was the big it was the airfield which launched more successful fighter Hurricane and Spitfire attacks on the Nazi Luftwaffe raiders of the Blitz. So they had more kills from that airfield than anywhere else. And that's where we were based. And this is back in the 1980s. So that's how I kind of got started. But I'd also got into campaigning and land rights. I was always very interested in human rights. So I was trying to make sure that when we were selling aircraft parts, they weren't going to dictatorships and that sort of thing. So the idea is we've got an ethical business here. And it was successful at the time. British owned, and of course the aviation business was massive after the Second World War in Britain. We were producing loads of aircraft. I think it's Filton Airfield in Bristol, more aircraft than anywhere else on the planet were flying out of Filton, because they were being assembled elsewhere and also built elsewhere and assembled in Filton during the war. So I got aviation in my blood in a way. So I then got out of that because I was sort of bored with it really, and into journalism, and started working in 1989 for the BBC in central London at a very busy newsroom in an exciting station which the BBC called Greater London Radio. The BBC had set it up to compete with the commercials, very successful LBC and Capital Radio. And so we had a bit of an experiment in a way for a few years there, where the BBC was behaving much more populist, so we were kind of a tabloidy style radio station with a mix of quite a lot of sort of indie and rock music in the early 1990s, and some quite well-known people, DJs like Tommy Vance, Johnny Walker, were really popular. And the people listening to us in London they really were, in their many millions listening in London to us. knew we were on their side. They just knew, because these DJs were used to working with crowds, but suddenly they were doing hard news interviews as well. And it was great fun, and it was, I think, a massive success. But the BBC pulled the plug on it a few years afterwards. So that's how I got started as a researcher, and then carried on as a journalist. And then I was just sacked, basically. They said they've run out of money, although I was quite suspicious about the fact that we'd been pursuing stories in Salisbury, in Wiltshire, about child sexual abuse at children's homes. So I've no idea if that was why I was relieved of my job, but it was where Ted Heath was living, the former British Prime Minister. So that's a basic introduction to me. We're now doing a show in Bristol. We have been since 2008, every week, which is a couple of hours or 3 hours, sometimes even last night 4 hours, which is a weekly podcast which looks at local news, national news, and international news. And also we do a bit of a section on the occult. So the idea of secret societies, evil, basically, which seems to be a dimension to me which is entirely lacking from the mainstream media. So you very kindly put the book up there, The Siege of Heaven Reader, which really looks at the history of secret government in Britain and around the world, but mainly here in Britain, ever since the English Civil War, because we had a coup in the English Civil War with Oliver Cromwell and the merchant classes, the capitalists taking over from the feudal classes, which leads on to what we're going to be talking about, which is the British Empire, because the empire wouldn't have been possible without the industrialists, their dark satanic mills producing the equipment needed, the ships, etc., to go out and bully our way around the world in Britain. And one other thing I did get involved in for a few years in the 90s, late 90s, after the BBC, was land rights campaigning and organising mass trespasses, mass occupations in London and elsewhere, where, for example, in Wandsworth, we took over a big site next to Wandsworth Bridge where there was a whole load of expensive housing and a massive supermarket being planned. Well, there's nowhere for the ordinary local people. And so we just took it over and saying, where's your council housing? Where's your affordable housing? And eventually, we got evicted from there. But we made the point right across London. The idea is to put these things onto the agenda, is that housing and government should be there to fight the corner for the people that are falling between the gaps, where the rich and the powerful are just running the show, Adil.
Tony, is journalism? I know it's not exactly the topic, but I want to get you pick your brains in as brief time as possible. Is journalism a dying profession, considering that AI is taking over journalism? Personally, I don't believe that journalists can be replaced by AI, because AI is fed in the information. Journalists have got their own intelligence, God-gifted intelligence. It cannot be replaced. They've got their sources. They cannot be replaced. But there is a continuing discontent amongst the colleagues in the National Union of Journalists about the AI taking over journalism. And of course, the occult, the government which you're talking about, the one who are actually the top 1% running the rest 99 or 90% of the world. Do you believe they're going to succeed in taking over journalism?
Well, journalism isn't quite dying. I mean, it's being slowly strangled on the mainstream. But of course, the idea really is that the mainstream media now in the West is for the stupid people. And that much of the intelligent debate is going on online. Now, of course, online is trackable. It's also quite easy to close it down. And so I think basically what's happened is we have been corralled onto social media. There's an attempt to police everything we do on social media, which is much easier than it used to be. And so, yes, you're right. Journalism has been killed off. What you find is people like Peter Mandelson. I mean, this was what was going on when I was in journalism, is people were getting calls, editors were getting calls from Mandelson saying, get rid of this journalist. And so you've ended up with a mainstream press, which very few people trust anymore. So they've been sort of moved on to, but there are a few people like me still around. There's a very good program, the Crispin Flintoff Show. You know, I would also recommend Richie Allen, who does a weekly program from Salford in Manchester. There are a few, but then there's lots of controlled opposition too. So the people who are trying to look like they are alternative media, where actually they are really just an outlet for the deep state in one way or another. So it's a very contested. I would like to see, and this is my honest, you know, the National Union of Journalists. I've been on the New Media Industrial Council now for something like 15 years, discussing all these issues about AI. And as AI started to come along, I've been sort of elbowed out of the New Media Industrial Council. And this is a great pity for me. I mean, it's like the union is slowly being subsumed by AI itself. There is a bit of a debate, but nowhere near as fierce enough criticism, because journalist jobs are, of course, being totally destroyed and undermined by artificial intelligence, which is totally programmed. I did an experiment actually where a couple of books, which were in my other book, which I happen to have here, which is all about the end game of the Second World War, where with Winston Churchill's private secretary doing deals with Adolf Hitler's private secretary. So there's a couple of important books. Yeah, that's it. There are a couple of important books I used to write that. And I thought, well, let's just feed those into AI and to see if AI can figure out the key bits in these books. And so I actually asked AI, what do you think are the most important points being made in these books? And of course, there's nothing in the AI response at all to understand the importance of, for example, the specific links between Churchill and Hitler in the negotiations before the end of the Second World War. And so it's I think absolutely useless. It's totally artificial, really. It's for lazy people, people who just can't be bothered to actually read through. And so, no, it's no replacement for journalism at all. All it is it's another way of replacing real journalists. And so, yes, journalism is under attack. You're absolutely right.
So today we've got two very important topics, which is since you can see the flag behind me, the flag of the United Kingdom, the Union Jack, and Pakistani flag. And Pakistan has been a colony of the British Empire. All right. So first topic I wanted to explore with you is, and the second topic is interconnected, so I'll come to that later. The first topic is that what we are witnessing as a geopolitical analyst and as a journalist, what we are witnessing is that the British Empire, which effectively started disintegrating after the Second World War because of the promises they had made with the colonies that if they will help them in the Second World War, they will get their freedom. I'm talking about the subcontinent of India and Pakistan. Later, Bangladesh turned up as well. Well, they did fulfill those promises, but the British Empire left behind a legacy of fault lines globally. And those fault lines, for example, Kashmir, is still keeping the United Kingdom relevant, United Kingdom's foreign policy relevant in a way that the United Kingdom is, it is performing the role of a bridge between the US global hegemony or the US empire or the new empire and the rest of the world.
Well, so this is not British. This isn't just a British thing. Okay, so think of Taiwan, think of Korea, because the Americans have learned from the British. Now, I think to understand the British Empire, I know it's maybe not what you want or expect, but I think we have to go back to the reign of Elizabeth I, because this is where it really started. I came across a fascinating article from the Royal Observatory, it's the Greenwich Maritime Museum in Greenwich, by the deputy curator there, all about a chap called John Dee, where he discovered an old book which had been published in the 16th century and been kept secret, all about how to build an empire, written by John Dee. John Dee was the WWIII. He was a sort of Secret Service agent and occultist friend of Elizabeth I. And so what they'd done at that time is they had set set in train a secret plan to build an empire. And then what happened about 100 years later, I mean, that was at the time of the Reformation, of course, as they were breaking up all the monasteries and consolidating the power in the hands of the monarchy to direct the empire, I think. And then about 100 years later, we had an English Civil War, you know, with between Charles I and Oliver Cromwell. And this was because Charles I had seen the symptoms of the beginnings of the creation of empire in lots and lots of destitute people who'd been evicted in the enclosures from the countryside and were being forced to go and work in cheap labor, building all the equipment for the empire, ships and all this sort of thing, and work in cities for the industrialists. And Charles I said, no, you're not going to do this. The people we can't have families living in ditches in the countryside. And so he stopped all that. And that's why really, I think that was precipitated the Civil War, because he was fining all these merchants that were enclosing land and evicting people. And that was really the beginning of urbanization. You know, as those enclosures happened, we started to have mass urbanization in Britain more quicker than anywhere else. Anyway, the rest is history. Charles I lost his head, and the merchant classes basically took over during the Civil War from the feudal system that had been put there by the Normans. So as time went on, obviously the empire expanded. The British sent their ships out, bullying everybody. First of all, it's very much like the Phoenician Empire, actually, from literally like 1000 BC. Is they would go out, start trading, make friends, and then infiltrate and take over. So the Phoenicians did exactly the same as the British were doing. So Dee, I think, was borrowing quite a bit from the old Phoenician Empire. They were basically like an intelligence service for the Egyptian pharaohs back in those days. Anyway, we don't want to go quite that far back. And so as time progressed, the British started taking over more and more. And I think the next important stage was Cecil Rhodes and the will of Cecil Rhodes, because he had become incredibly wealthy through the colonization of Southern Africa. And he had decided with some of his mates, a round table, he called it, that Britain could now prepare to take over the world. And so in his will, he wrote a whole load of money to go to these basically secret societies, creation of things like the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, as it eventually became, and Chatham House in central London, which were private foreign policy think tanks. Now, the idea is that the capitalist class can just funnel loads of its money into these private foreign policy think tanks and get what it wants. And so this is how Cecil Rhodes then thought, well, we're going to take over everything now. And they started to do that. Obviously, the British Empire became it was modeled, Adil, I think, on the Roman Empire. The idea really was, they borrowed from a lot of people, the Phoenicians and the Romans, but the eventual outcome of it was that they co-opted local leaders, as you know, in India and what is now Pakistan. The idea was, we'll find friendly locals, just as the Romans did when they came to invade Britain in 43 AD. We'll find some cooperative locals, put them in charge. What we'll do is we'll then institute a reasonably fair system of justice, and everyone will start to love us. And of course, actually, that they did. A lot of people found their living standards increasing under the Roman Empire, and systems of justice being instituted around the world under the British. So it wasn't all about just extracting wealth, but the British didn't want trouble. They just want the wealth to flow nice and easy out of the country to them. And so Cecil Rhodes, I suppose, embodied this bigger attempt, which was world domination. And that's where it all came unstuck. So fast forward on to the Second World War, where it all started changing. I mean, the First World War, I think we can see really as a family squabble between the Russian Tsar, Kaiser Wilhelm, and King George in Britain. They were basically all cousins, and they all fell out. And so we had a horrific war. But the outcome of the war was absolutely clear. The First World War, Allenby, he swept up right the way through Palestine at the last 2 years of World War I. And then literally, as soon as he removed the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, from Palestine, then they signed the armistice, and this is when the stage at which the Balfour Declaration was published. So World War I you can look upon as really just a kind of cover operation for the British taking over Palestine in order to then, a few years later, hand it over to the Israelis in World War II. So that's a kind of, I mean, in a nutshell, that for a lot of people, particularly in the Middle East, they're now looking at World War I and World War II as revolving around actually the creation of this Crusader state that we now have, which goes back even further, doesn't it, to the old Crusades? Look, so anyway,
another fault line left of the colonial legacy.
Absolutely right. Yeah, and this is what they do all the time. This was arranged with the French, of course, through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, secret agreement, which we only know about that because of the Bolshevik Revolution. In Russia in 1917, the Bolsheviks said, "Oh, look at this interesting agreement. I didn't know about this." So they published the Sykes-Picot Agreement for the world to see. And of course, the British and the French went, "Oh, sorry, we didn't really want people to know about that." And so that's how they divided up the Middle East. And I think if you go, sort of more up to date, the Americans have basically I mean, the British lost the Second World War. They lost their empire. They lost we've lost our industry now, although I think that's probably more to do with the City of London. But the Americans then took over. So the idea is, like you say, when you leave, you always try to leave all sorts of problems. Think about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, for example. There's another problem. The British left Yemen in the 1960s. A friend of mine was a soldier over there. And we left without really hardly any shots being fired compared to the recent horrific slaughter of the Yemenis by the British and the Saudis that we've seen. And so these fault lines were left all over the place. The idea is, this is a sort of divide and rule tactic, isn't it? So you have a neo-colonial IMF and financial empire where you get your local natives who are now running things. This is after World War II, into debt, and then you control them through debt relief. So you say, if you do this, we'll give you another tranche of money from the IMF. And that's what they've been doing all over the world. Now, that is now being contested, of course, in Africa quite a lot. Countries have realized what they're up to. And so the European powers and the Americans are slowly but surely being elbowed out of Africa, quite right too.
So tell me just a bit more about the UK's and the US relationship in this particular scene, this particular geopolitical, the new empire, the neo-colonization through there was this very famous book by John Perkins. I don't know if you read it or not, The Confessions of an International Economic Hitman. So by placing international economic hitmen around the globe, they have been controlling it, and it is being contested by various organizations. I mean, Gaddafi tried to do it. We all know what happened to him. But well, let's not go there. But what's happening right now? Let's stick to the current affairs. The U.S. financial hegemony is being challenged by countries like BRICS, by China, Russia, India, South Africa, combined together. Of course, they're a long way off from what they're planning to do. But do you think is it a serious threat? Firstly, but more importantly, what is the UK's role in playing a bridge between the US hegemony to the rest of the world and employing the divide and rule tactics or the fault lines left behind? And is the UK still effective? I mean, is the UK benefiting? Are the people in the UK benefiting from this tactic or not, or the strategy?
No, not in any way. Look, the life in Britain has been going down through the floor. Really, the standard of living, the disposable income here is appalling. So, when I was growing up in the early 1970s, it was fairly easy to get any job. A job would pay the mortgage, electricity bill, and the housewife could stay at home, no problem, all this sort of thing. So now you've got to get two parents, really, like as soon as they're thinking, can I afford to have a child? If they have a child, then they've immediately got to go out and get two jobs. Look, it's been an absolute disaster economically. But more, what you're asking about the United States and Britain, I go back to Cecil Rhodes, because these organizations which he's created, and of course in many other countries across Europe mainly too, the Institutes for International Affairs are working extremely closely together. In fact, it's really a sort of secret network. That's how Cecil Rose wanted it to work. And so the British and the Americans, there's also Carol Quigley is a very important author. One of his books is called The Anglo-American Establishment, and it looks at the power elite in London and in the United States. And remember, Britain created the United States, really. I mean, actually, what you're talking to me in the city of Bristol, which is where John Cabot sailed in 1497 out to Newfoundland, and he did another trip a couple of years later, so-called discovering America, when of course it had already been discovered quite a long time previously by all the Native Americans. And then I call it a reconnaissance for genocide, because, and I'm not kidding, around about 50 million Native Americans were killed by the European powers, mainly the Brits, in taking over North America and creating this new world, so-called New World Order, United States, that we now see. And the power the United States now wields is absolutely far, far greater than what the Nazis had in the 1930s and 1940s. And of course, they've got a similar attitude, which shouldn't be too surprising because so many Nazis in Operation Paperclip went over to the United States. So the Americans seem to think that they can intervene and bomb and invade any country that they want. And so this is Britain's poison child. I think the Americans are sort of a bit beholden to the Brits as any colonial power. I mean, so for example, when I visit New Zealand or Australia, they're all sort of a little bit like, oh, you're from England, you know, the mother country. Well, no, you know, not really. Actually, the natives here are really the indigenous people here, and you're sort of ex-colonists. So, I mean, one thing has been quite good is the English language. I think is a useful tool in order to help understand. I see, for example, people like RT. They do some stuff. They don't translate the major speeches of their leaders, their advisors, etc., apart from Zakharova, into English. And you think, well, why on earth not? Because this is exactly what the BBC want. They just don't. They want to look at your thing and say, oh, we can't play that because it's not in English, and we have to translate it, and that's too much bother. So English is, I think, the language in which the future is being discussed and the various problems in the world are being sorted out. But yeah, we're very close to the Americans, and particularly at the what I call tampon Charlie level. Now, I've got not very much respect for King Charles. I think there's been a massive change, Adil, in this country. When the Queen died, she is quoted as saying, I do not trust any Israeli because they're either a terrorist or the son of a terrorist. That's the words of Elizabeth II. And she wouldn't let any of the Israelis into any of her palaces for events and that sort of thing. She didn't trust them. She knew people who had been killed by Israeli terrorists in the 1940s, for example. Very personal friends of hers had been blown up by the Zionist terror gangs. And but now she's gone. And in fact, it was amazing when she died, the funeral cortege that went, it was supposed to go through the whole country, but Charles decided to fly it down to London. And I think it should have really gone through the whole country, really, by road slowly. And then they drove it from central London up to, I think it was to Windsor for her to be buried. And to see all the people come out and say goodbye, it was like we were saying goodbye to an era where Britain had kind of got out of empire. We decided, right, we're not going to be an empire anymore, but we still had a lot of the socialist values from the post-war era, which were, we look after the poor, we look after the mentally ill, we pay for them, and the government serves the people in this country. It's a proper Christian country where you put others before yourself, and the government's doing that. Now, to see the Queen going to Windsor to be buried, I think was that was the end of that era. And Charles is a different person completely. As you can see, he's not hands off. He gets involved in a lot of these negotiations, for example, with the nuclear powers in Europe threatening Russia. He's hands on with all this sort of thing. And so, that and also, of course, the US establishment is very, very close to Charles, as is the Canadian establishment. These people are all good friends, and they're all agreed that what Israel is doing is right, whereas the rest of the country thinks it's wrong. And the same, I think, mostly with Russia. A lot of the public opinion is anti-Russia, but anyone that knows what's going on knows that there has been assaults on the Russian state ever since the era of Napoleon. Hitler, it was the latest massive attack on Russia. And so the Russians, yes, they invaded Ukraine, but they invaded the Russian part of Ukraine, which was separated. So we go back again to these post-colonial fault lines, don't we? The Ukraine was deliberately created to include the Russian-speaking areas of that part of Russia, that part of the Soviet Union, in order to create a fault line, which we now see. And of course, the Russians are quite right to say, well, look, you can't be bullying and attacking these Russian-speaking people. We're not going to allow it. And so to draw a line and say the Russian-speaking areas are going to be part of Russia and the Ukrainian-speaking areas continue to be part of Ukraine. But the NATO countries have been attacking, bullying all the way since the coup in 2014. And it was it was inevitable that the Russians are going to respond eventually, because the Ukrainians had killed 15,000 people between 2014 and 22 by shelling the Donbass, the autonomous region that didn't want to be part of Kiev, the Russian-speaking area. And so that's another one of these fault lines which has been deliberately created. That time it was created by the Bolsheviks, the Soviet Union. Stalin and his faction, I think it was under Khrushchev, they created the new borders for Ukraine and included Crimea with it, for example. And so this is one of the ways, I think, they create trouble, they create chaos. And by that chaos, they think, control geopolitics and control the game from behind the scenes. So when we see a Donald Trump, when we see a Boris Johnson or a Keir Starmer, these are not the people who are in control. It's like the Wizard of Oz. The other ones are behind the curtain. They're committees. And if you want to understand, I'll say this finally, if you want to understand who these committees are, what they are, have a look at the 1980s P2 scandal in Italy, where the prime minister was kidnapped because the Americans wanted to stop the communists getting into power. And what was revealed at that time was this committee called P2, Propaganda Due, run by Licio Gelli, who's a fascist under Mussolini, but this was in the 1980s. And what they found out was a whole list of people who had been running the country from behind the scenes and ordered the kidnapping of the prime minister. And this was army chiefs, this was intelligence chiefs, this was police chiefs, this was newspaper owners, this was heads of industry and heads of political parties. But most of the people around that table who were running Italy in the 1980s at the P2 Lodge, Masonic Lodge, were actually, they were unknown to the public. They're people who you would pass in the street and wouldn't even recognize them. And so I've written a bit about this in my book about the Bilderbergers, because this is another organization which was set up after World War II by the NATO powers and by the military. And the whole idea of the Bilderberg is to control political leadership within the NATO countries. And that's what they've been doing very successfully ever since 1954. People like Tony Blair selected at Bilderberg meeting a couple of years before. Actually, it was a year before he became party leader. He went to one of these meetings. They liked him, and suddenly he's in charge. The former leader, John Smith, is dead and died in a mysterious heart attack. And the thing that really concerned me to get into writing about the Bilderbergers was, number one, the lies and the secrecy I saw coming out about them in 2000, but also the discovery that for the first 20 years, this organization was chaired by a former SS officer from the Second World War, who then married into the Dutch royal family. But he was one of the first members of the SS, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, and he chaired the Bilderberg meetings from 1954 to 1974, when he was outed as a crook and a criminal by the journalists in Holland. I mean, he was involved in an arms scandal of some kind. So I think that we're now in the grip of this kind of magic spell of people who just feel that they want to control and own everything. And they're not going to leave things for the public to vote in who they want in the West anymore. And they certainly aren't going to allow them to hear and see the things they really need to know. For example, the fact that all over Britain, in about 30 cities this week, we've had commemorations for Hiroshima Day, vigils, peace vigils in cities. Now, the national press hasn't reported this. They've reported what's going on in Japan for the 80th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, but they don't report the fact that every city, most cities in Britain, have had the campaign for nuclear disarmament has been advertising this, but the press have been looking the other way. So a big part of all of this, Adil, is, goes back to journalism and the betrayal by the mainstream press, as by the politicians, of the people that they're supposed to serve.
Well, Tony, that's a very interesting point of view. And obviously, you know what you're talking about. You've written books about it. There is an opposing point of view as well, who think that, well, what Tony is saying, well, it should not be said. And you've got to be careful once you're talking to Tony, because Tony is speaking a bit too much of the truth, and he's showing mirror to the mighty and the powerful. The thing about them is, it was very interesting once you brought out the chaos theory. Well, the thing about the chaos theory is that you can initiate chaos to profit out of it, but you can only ascertain the immediate outcome of the chaos. You can never control the long-term outcome of chaos, deliberately or created unintentionally, but chaos cannot be controlled in the long term. But for that, you very rightly brought out Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes, the super ultra rich mining magnate and the former prime minister. Well, the thing is that Cecil Rhodes is represent the present days. I mean, he was a mining magnate, and even today President Trump is going after critical minerals of the world, and it is a war of resources. I mean, nothing much has changed. It is still the competition for resources and to make big money is still there. 1% of the super rich have got more money than the combined 90% of the world. So the same thing is going on. The great divide in the world is not between religions, it's not about geography, it's not about borders, it's not about race, it's not about anything else, but it is about those who are at the top 1% and 90% below them, and the 9% in between trying to climb up to that 1%. So that is there. All right, fine. But why I was talking about Cecil Rhodes was that he created these organizations, which are still, you named a few of them, which are still here, which are still very much functional, which still invite global leaders at their platforms, and they invite them into the closed gatherings, which are controlled, and they speak like the Pakistani military dictator Asim Munir was here. He gave a speech to Chatham House, I believe, and then they go to the Council of Foreign Relations, and they go to this privately funded think tanks in the US and the UK. And they're creating policies, and the people who are funding them are these top 1% people. I mean, they're not publicly funded organizations. So they still have got an influence, right? So by extension, the UK has still got an influence. I'm talking about specifically Pakistan in this regard. Just very briefly, why can't the UK use that kind of influence to, free Imran Khan? Leader who is supported by the British Pakistanis, and we have seen it time and again in London, rest of the UK, people coming out to support Imran Khan. But why they are not, playing their part? They're not playing their part in a way they can. They're not.
Okay. So the reason is very simple: is because they don't want Imran Khan anywhere near the reins of power in Pakistan, because they don't believe in democracy. They believe in oligarchy. They want oligarchs to be controlling Pakistan. They want to demonize such a popular leader, as they've done in many other parts of the world over the years. In fact, you know, I think it's quite correct for Imran Khan's immediate relatives to talk about his possible assassination. They want him out of the way. No person, no problem, as Stalin used to say in his rather dry tones. But look, you know, you talking about what's. I mean, it's really, I think, all of this is about world domination. If you go back to Ian Fleming's Dr. No and some of the early Bond films and books, that's what they say. World domination. This is what actually James Bond says. As he looks at the villain, he says, world domination, same old dream. And of course, that is exactly what it's about. They don't want to have anybody anywhere in the world who is able to say no to them. I mean, look at the American attitude. Is as appalling. This is exactly what they're doing right now with the tariffs, but they've been doing it all over the Middle East, of course, for years and years and years. And of course, the British were doing it in the days of building empire. But Fleming is a very important figure, actually. Ian Fleming. When he was in the Second World War, he was involved in, you'll find out a lot about him in my book, because he was involved in this operation to bring Martin Bormann out of Nazi Germany right at the end of the war. Bormann was important because he was the signatory to the bank accounts of all of the loot that the Nazis had looted over the 6 years of World War II from the whole of Europe, which was a fantastic amount that they put into these Swiss bank accounts. But the signatory was Bormann. And so the British brought him out. And Fleming was involved in that, as was John Ainsworth Davis, who wrote a book called Op JB, all about it in the 1990s. And what Fleming was able to do, of course, after the Second World War, after these things had been going on, actually, if you look at the historical record, in the early 50s, Fleming had hit the bottle. He was drinking and drinking, almost like drinking himself to death, because he knew about all these secrets from the war, which were so horrible. Betrayal of the people who'd been fighting, for example. And but he couldn't write about it because of the Official Secrets Act. Now, he also had another friend who was in the Whitehall war room directing the war, a psychological warfare officer who was, before the war, was a novelist. His name was Dennis Wheatley. He wrote for some famous occult books as well, novels. But he was a brilliant historical novelist. But he was brought in because he had such a sharp mind as a psychological warfare officer during the war. They used to call, during the Second World War, deception planner. And so Wheatley could see Fleming going downhill drinking. And he said, look, don't get upset about all the stuff that went on in the war, because you can get it all out of your system by writing it out as fiction, and they can't touch you. So that's why we have this whole sort of James Bond novel legacy, which, by the way, they are cracking reads. They're really good, because he knew about how things really work and how dastardly the officials, intelligence people can be. And he got that. And so that's why I come back to this world domination, same old dream. Fleming understood there are other forces out there that the public never see, that the soldiers never see. They're actually involved in creating and directing wars through geopolitical aims. The big problem for the oligarchy in the West at the moment is Russia, because Vladimir Putin took over Russia in a very clever and unexpected way in 2000. They were expecting Putin to be a puppy dog, basically. I mean, I say they, I'm talking about the oligarchs who controlled Russia at the time. Boris Berezovsky was the chief oligarch, but there's a whole load of other super rich people trained in Switzerland to rape the country, to basically take it over and sell it off and make money in the 1990s, which they did, and they collapsed the economy. But anyway, Putin, when he took over in 2000, Berezovsky was expecting that he was going to be able to just order Putin around, because he had dirt on Putin to do with the 1999 cover-up of the FSB blowing up apartment buildings in Ryazan and Moscow. And he thought, oh, I can just use this. If Putin starts to mess about, I'll just expose him. on my NTV television channel, which Berezovsky owned, the first private TV channel in the new Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so Putin turned the tables on Berezovsky. As soon as he was in power, he got his prosecutor to collect as much dirt, and there was plenty of dirt that hadn't been prosecuted on Berezovsky, turned the tables on the guy. And Berezovsky was phoned by Putin one Friday to say, look, on Saturday, the prosecutors are going to come and arrest you. I'm giving you a call because I'm your friend. Just get out the country and I'll sort it out. And the rest is history, because Berezovsky never came back to Russia. And Putin had sent a message to all the oligarchs in Russia, don't mess with me. I'm the president. And if you do put your fingers into politics and the Kremlin, then you're going to end up like Berezovsky, or you're going to jail. So Putin basically at that point took control of Russia from the oligarchs that the West had hoped were going to rape it and put it on the sort of, on the open market, and the stock exchange. So that's why I think the West is, and in the 20 years after he took over, Putin was quietly building up an absolutely invincible, I would use that word, invincible military force to take on the United States, because he knew at some point he was going to have to take on the US. And so he was very friendly with the West for many years, going to the World Economic Forum, being part of the WEF Global Leaders Group, etc. Meanwhile, he's cleverly building up some incredible military strike capabilities, the Oreshnik and things like this, which are now in service, I hear. And so the West hates him, because they tried to control him. They lost control of Russia, and he's now an independent force. The other aspect of this is that Russia is, of course, Orthodox. Russia and a lot of the Eastern European countries are Orthodox Church, because the Catholic Church has always, I think, been controlled by the occult, by the Jesuits, all the way through. They were behind the Norman invasion of Britain, for example, when the Normans took over Britain in 1066. They weren't Christians; they were Vikings from Normandy. And so what I'm saying is that the Catholics and the Protestants have always been embracing this kind of secret rule of the church at the very top, whereas the Orthodox haven't. And that's another thing that the West really doesn't like about the Russians, is that their church is a genuine, original church, going right back to the days of the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament. And theirs is a fake church, a false church in this part of the world, which at the very top, it sells its soul. And so there's all sorts of reasons why I think Russia is really one of the only independent, free-thinking third forces in the world. The Chinese and the Americans, I find, are both basically controlled by from behind the scenes, whether it's the triads, etc., in China, or the Freemasons in the United States. That's what we're looking at, I think, now, is the world settling out into these two empires, China Empire and America Empire, with the Russians very inconveniently sitting up there in the north, watching all of this and knowing that if China and America do come to blows eventually, that Russia will clear up the world. And that's very worrying for the Brits. We don't want to have this war with a third world war with China, because the Russians, and so that's why I think the West is really now trying to bring Russia down as low as they can, and in fact eliminate them before there is a big third world war between the United States and China. And of course, many of the countries like India and Pakistan, they are also being forced really to take one side or the other. And a lot of this, the fault lines lie around, as you said earlier, the Israel-Palestine conflict. I mean, how can anybody take the side of the Israelis in this situation? But the oligarchy do, the super rich do, and the media to a large extent do here in the West. They're very, very pro-Israel. They will make noises about, we want to finish the war, but they do absolutely nothing. We have hundreds of thousands of military personnel, Adil, in the West who right now could get involved in dropping food into Gaza, but they won't, because they're quietly actually trying to stoke this conflict up. And who knows? This could bring in Iran. It could bring in the United States to Israel, which has already got a lot of troops in the region. It could bring in China, and it could spark a third world war. And so why don't we just do what needs doing, which is to face off the Israelis and get food into Gaza right now, and have a UN peacekeeping force or something in there to protect the civilians. And no soldier worth their meat, and you've been a soldier, actually should be fighting civilians. And actually no honest soldier ever would attack and fight and kill civilians. And that's what we're seeing day after day after day. And if the civilians aren't actually being actively killed by the bombers or by the soldiers, they're now being starved to death as well. So the world has got to really wake up to this and do something immediately. Can't allow this to carry on. Anybody who's involved in any of the military forces anywhere in the West or anywhere else in the world should be urging their commanders to, right, okay, let's find some volunteers and get aid in there now.
Tony, very interesting debate over here, controversial as it is, but very interesting, definitely. Finally, you were talking about the great power rivalry at play in the world. All right, how do you see this great power rivalry between the US-led West and, well, you can't really make out that whether it is the Chinese who are leading or the Russians who are leading or rest of their partners. I mean, there are most of the partners who seem to be on the Chinese side are playing both sides. For example, India, such a big economy. Right now, they are at loggerheads with President Trump, who has just increased the trade tariff to 50%. But as a response, the Indians are not, giving up, and they are going to. The Indian National Security Advisor was in Moscow day before yesterday. I don't know whether he's still there or not. But at the same time, they've got support in Moscow, but they are at they've got their own rivalry going on with the Chinese, who are supporting the Pakistanis against the Indians. So, I mean, there is a lot of the discontent or say fault lines in the Chinese-led alliance or the Russian-led alliance. Where compared to that, the US-led Western alliance is still intact. I mean, there are problems between NATO and the President Trump, but it is still very much intact, considering the fault line of the problems of the other side. So, how do you see this great power rivalry playing out, and what would be the immediate and long-term results of that?
Well, I think this is like the biggest load of chaos theory you're ever going to see in your lifetime if you survive it and live to see it, which is a third world war. That's what they want, I believe. And the purpose of it, I mean, they've obviously got to have the two sides to have the war. We call the hardening of the sides in intelligence circles, where you get everybody, no one's allowed to be independent. Everybody, whether they're an individual or a nation, has got to take sides. That's what the Americans did in Vietnam, et cetera, in order to get that war going. So the purpose of it is, I think, to put the Third World War across as a war caused by religion, caused by the Jewish and Muslim conflict in the Middle East. And of course, it's not really like that, because the Zionists have got very, very little Jewish. Biblical Jewish, Judaistic about them, because really the Abrahamic faiths are all the same. The Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims are all based on the Ten Commandments. They're all based on these Abrahamic ideas, and of course there are many Jews, whether secular or religious Jews, who are totally against what's going on right now. So this is an artificially created construct. And as people like a very good Muslim author, David Livingstone, is writing about, is that the origins of Nazism and Zionism are in the very similar people and same individuals. Some of them around the circles of Richard Wagner, the composer, the German composer. A lot of these people were circulating around him. The Zionists, the early Zionists, and the people who were eventually to create the Nazi Party. And so that, I think, is the purpose, is to have a world war, blame it on religion, and then to basically sweep the Abrahamic faiths from the earth. That seems to be their purpose, and bring in their own kind of new age religion. a kind of yin-yang style, multi-faith religion, which is a man-made thing. So really, it's like sticking two fingers up at God, effectively. And as Catherine Austin Fitts said, it's a war on God. A lot of this is subtle. It's very subtle. The intelligence people, I think, understand that subtlety. In that, the idea is to blame God for the war. But I think that, as I said again, the Russians are a bit of a thorn in their side, so they're making it extremely difficult for them to carry on. You can go back, if you want, to Albert Pike, the Grand Master of the Scottish Rite Freemasons in the 1870s, who wrote a letter saying we're going to have 3 world wars. The first one is going to be to clear out the Ottomans from Palestine. The second one to institute a Crusader state, and the third one, a massive conflict in order to discredit all of the faiths. So he was a Masonic leader who was in touch with the Italian Mazzini. And you'll find that even the Daily Express wrote an article about that, and the Daily Mail have written about. But there is some doubt about that letter as to whether it's real. But there were various people quoting it, different individuals, that it was lodged in the British Museum over, and then suddenly around about the 1960s, someone went, "Oh, we can't find this document anymore, and there's no record of it." But it seems to me to explain pretty well what we're seeing in the world today, Adil, which is basically a bunch of secret society maniacs behind the scenes who, for their own personal benefit and for the oligarchy that are so wealthy around the world, are trying to literally create the biggest chaos we've ever seen on planet Earth, which could involve nuclear war too, in order to convince everybody that the outcome, that they should be able to control it and institute a new faith and a new religion. But I honestly think, let's be clear, they're on a hiding to nothing. A lot of people are going to die. I think a lot more people are going to die. But at the end of the day, people will see exactly what they're up to, and that we will have a kind of apotheosis. You could call it a revelation moment, or an Armageddon moment, where God comes back in the form of Christ or whatever. I imagine it's probably him, and says, "No, we're not going to do this. We're not having this." And so that battle, I think, is what the other side is. In fact, isn't it interesting to see people like Peter Thiel from PayPal, and of course, big funder of Palantir and other companies like that, major profiteer from Facebook, etc. These big social media companies. He's doing at the Hudson Institute, doing an interview, making out that he's a Christian and saying, "Oh, isn't it interesting? The Antichrist could be coming along soon, and we could have everything unfolding like the Book of Revelation." But he's doing it. He's actually doing it. Now, this is what we call Gnosticism, where the bad guys in these biblical prophecies, maybe, I mean, I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen, but that they want to portray and use the mass media to portray themselves as the good guys, even though they're the guys that are creating all the chaos. So anyway, there's quite a weird adjunct to all of this, and I was just amazed to see Thiel just doing a chit chat about the Antichrist and how it's all going to happen in the Book of Revelation and this sort of thing, because he's the one person I would suggest is causing more chaos than anyone else on the planet. And particularly, I'll finish on this, and particularly artificial intelligence is nothing to do with anything but extracting human emotions and feelings and morals from decision making. So they want military, they want political decisions to be being made by computers, because computers will do what they want, and human beings often, like you, won't.
So we're looking at World War III, which will be a war on God, ladies and gentlemen. That was Tony Gosling. Tony, where can the viewers find you, actually? Because I'm sure there'll be many people who'll be interested to follow you. So if you could please tell the viewers briefly, where can they find you?
Well, I'm on Twitter. I still call it Twitter, at Tony Gosling, just one word. I do a Facebook page, but most importantly, I've got an app and a show, a weekly program where you can hear all sorts of interesting stuff. This week we've got David talking about all these links between the Nazis and the Zionists, David Livingston from Montreal. Plus, we've got Craig Murray, who's the former ambassador to Uzbekistan, giving a very detailed explanation of all of the legal shenanigans to do with the banning of Palestine action, and also looking at the collapse of the rule of law in Britain and in Israel with the Netanyahu's attempts to get rid of the Supreme Court in Israel, to sack the person who is prosecuting him. So these are the men of lawlessness, whether it's King Charles, Tampon Charlie, as I call him here in Britain, or whether it's Netanyahu. They are on a hiding to nothing, and also they're tearing up all the rules. They can't expect us to abide by the rules when they won't themselves, Adil. So that's the website's thisweek.org.uk for the weekly show. The stream is at talkradio.org.uk. If you want to listen to that anytime, 11 a.m., 5 a.m. or p.m., anytime during the week, you can just listen into our weekly program where we look at all sorts. I mean, for example, the local story this week is all to do with the last green space around Bristol Harbour, which Bristol City Council themselves decided, we don't want the green space. Funnily enough, it's a Green Party in control of Bristol, but they've decided they want to just hand all this money over, this land over to developers to build houses all over the last bit of green space on the harbour. So we look into all of this stuff, and we also do deep investigations into corruption in the police and Avon and Somerset Police and in Bristol City Council. And the people running this city, are the merchant venturers. They own the city. The merchant venturers are a group which was involved in the John Cabot trip. In fact, they financed the trip of John Cabot over to North America. They're constituted under a royal charter, and so journalists like you and I can't investigate them. Only the Privy Council can investigate them. They're not registered at Companies House or anything like that, but there they sit up on the hill in Clifton. And it's basically like the Bristol Illuminati, I call them. We're not supposed to think that they exist or know what they do at all. And yet there they are running, it seems to me, the city through their big land speculator and developer friends. So the shows at thisweek.org.uk, the books are The Traitors of Arnhem, which is about the Martin Bormann and the Bilderberg Group, which is about the secret deals done between Churchill's private secretary Desmond Morton and Hitler's private secretary Martin Bormann in late 1944, in fact, late 1944, secret deals. We all know about the Americans' Operation Paperclip, but what about the Brits doing deals with the Nazis, secret deals? And the other one is The Siege of Heaven Reader, which is really much more like a sort of coffee table book with lots of extracts from interesting articles I found interesting about secret government in Britain, right the way from the English Civil War right up to the assassination of Princess Diana, which is a whole other story. Maybe one day we can go there. But anyone with a half a brain in Britain knows that, in fact, most people on the council estates are quite happy to chit chat to you about, Diana was assassinated. We all know. It's only the mainstream media and the politicians that don't want to talk about these things and that they believe the lies. But we know what's really going on, don't we?
Yeah, well, we do, Tony, but you're going to get me in trouble if I let you go on. So I would just end the show over here. I'm sure it's been a very fantastic show. And ladies and gentlemen, this was Tony Gosling for you. You know where to find him. The spelling in his he was in a hurry, so he didn't spell his name correctly in the so that's G-O-S-L-I-N-G. I just noticed it. So that's Tony Gosling for you, ladies and gentlemen. Tony, thank you so very much for being a part of this program, Soldier of Speech exclusive, and I hope that we can do some more of such interesting programs in the near future. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you, Adil, and thanks for all you're doing. Very important. Imran Khan. I like the songs as well. I've heard some of the Pakistani songs about Imran Khan. Man, they're brilliant.
Yeah, they are, no doubt about it. So thank you, Tony. Thank you. See you soon. Bye-bye.